The small, quiet town of Fairfield, Missouri, rarely made the news. Its only notable feature was the Fairfield Correctional Facility, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of town. The prison employed many locals, including 35-year-old Joanna Marks, a respected senior corrections officer. To the outside world, Joanna was the picture of stability. She had been married to her high school sweetheart, Tom Marks, for 14 years, and they had two children. But behind closed doors, their marriage was not as perfect as it seemed. Joanna and Tom had an unconventional agreement, an open marriage. The decision had been made years ago to spice things up after their relationship hit a rough patch. At first, it seemed harmless. Tom would occasionally meet women at bars, and Joanna had her share of casual encounters. They had rules: no emotional attachments, no secrets, and always use protection. But as time went on, the lines blurred. Joanna's job at the prison became more than just a career. It became the stage for her indiscretions. Joanna was well liked by her colleagues and inmates alike. She had a no-nonsense attitude but treated everyone with respect. It was this combination of authority and empathy that caught the attention of two inmates, Derek D. Porter and Malik Johnson. Both men were serving long sentences for violent crimes. Derek was known for his charm, while Malik was quieter but equally dangerous. Joanna found herself drawn to both of them in ways she couldn't explain or resist. It started with harmless flirtation. Derek would compliment Joanna's hair or joke about her being the only light in this dark place. Malik, on the other hand, was more subtle, offering small gestures of kindness like helping her manage rowdy inmates. Over time, these interactions grew into something more. Joanna began spending extra time near their cells, talking to them about her life, her frustrations, and eventually her marriage. She convinced herself it was just harmless venting, but things escalated. One night, while on a late shift, Derek slipped Joanna a note. It was folded into a small square and tucked under his food tray. When Joanna read it in the staff break room, her heart raced. The note was explicit, describing what he wanted to do to her and how much he admired her. She should have reported it. It was against every rule in the book. But instead, she kept the note. Not long after, Malik made his move. During a routine inspection of his cell, he whispered something to Joanna that made her cheeks flush. "You deserve to be appreciated, Officer Marks. I'd treat you like a queen if I had the chance." Unlike Derek's boldness, Malik's approach was calculated, and it worked. Joanna started sneaking small favors for both men. Extra food, cigarettes, even a burner phone Derek had requested. It wasn't long before their flirtations turned physical. In the dimly lit utility closet of the prison, Joanna crossed a line she could never uncross. She had an intimate encounter with Derek, and a week later with Malik. She justified her actions by telling herself it was a part of their open marriage, but deep down, she knew this was different. She was breaking the law, risking her job, her family, and her freedom. Yet she couldn't stop. For months, Joanna juggled her secret relationships with the inmates while maintaining her facade at home. Tom remained oblivious, and their children were too young to notice the strain in their mother's demeanor. But cracks began to form. Joanna's guilt grew heavier with each passing day, and her once impeccable work record started to suffer. She showed up late, forgot assignments, and avoided her colleagues. Some of them started to suspect something was off, but no one dared to confront her, at least not yet. The breaking point came when Tom fell ill. It started with fatigue and flu-like symptoms, which he brushed off as a seasonal bug. But when the symptoms persisted for weeks, he went to see a doctor. The diagnosis shook him to his core. He was HIV positive. Tom was devastated. He hadn't been with anyone else in months and knew the only possible source was Joanna. When he confronted her, she broke down, admitting to the affairs but insisting she had always been careful. Tom didn't believe her. He demanded to know who she had been with and how she could have been so reckless. When Joanna refused to give details, he stormed out of the house, taking the kids to stay with his sister. Alone and desperate, Joanna realized her double life was crumbling around her. Tom filed for divorce and took a restraining order against Joanna, citing emotional distress and endangerment. But he didn't stop there. Furious and determined to uncover the truth, he went to the police. He told them about Joanna's confession, her risky behavior, and her job at the prison. His accusations set off a chain of events that would expose a scandal far bigger than anyone in Fairfield could have imagined. Detective Richard Calloway, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving high-profile cases, was assigned to the matter. Calloway was meticulous and relentless, known for uncovering even the most well-hidden secrets. When he first read Tom's statement, he knew this wasn't just a case of marital infidelity. It was something much darker. A corrections officer having affairs with inmates was a serious crime, and if true, it could shake the prison system to its core. Calloway began his investigation by interviewing Tom. The distraught husband provided as much information as he could, but there were still gaps in the story. Calloway then turned his attention to the prison. He requested access to employee records, security footage, and incident reports. What he found raised more questions than answers. There were several unexplained gaps in Joanna's shift logs, as well as missing footage from the prison's surveillance system. Multiple inmates had reported special treatment from certain guards, but their complaints had been dismissed as baseless. Calloway knew he needed to tread carefully. Corruption in prisons was not uncommon, and he suspected Joanna wasn't acting alone. The deeper Calloway dug, the more damning the evidence became. He uncovered text messages between Joanna and Derek from the burner phone, as well as notes Malik had hidden in his cell. Both men were known for manipulating female staff, and it seemed Joanna had fallen into their trap. But Calloway wasn't ready to place all the blame on the inmates. Joanna had made her choices, and those choices had consequences. By the time Calloway gathered enough evidence to confront Joanna, she was already under internal investigation by the prison administration. But this was no longer just a workplace issue. It was a criminal case. Joanna was arrested at her home, charged with misconduct, endangering public health, and facilitating contraband in the prison. As Joanna sat in the interrogation room, Calloway entered, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "You've got one chance to come clean, Joanna," he said, placing a stack of evidence on the table, "because I'm about to uncover every dirty secret you've been hiding." Joanna's hands trembled as she realized there was no way out. Her double life had caught up with her, and the cost would be greater than she ever imagined. Detective Richard Calloway had a reputation for cutting through deceit like a scalpel. The evidence against Joanna Marks was already damning, but his instincts told him there was more beneath the surface. Joanna sat across from him in the dimly lit interrogation room, her face pale and drawn. Her polished appearance as a respected prison guard had vanished, replaced by someone clearly drowning in guilt and fear. "Joanna," Calloway began, his voice calm but firm, "I've got text messages, surveillance gaps, and witnesses who saw you sneaking around. You're looking at serious charges. But if you tell me the whole truth, I might be able to help you." Joanna hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me everything. How it started, what you did, and why." The silence stretched on, but eventually Joanna broke. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't plan for any of this. It just happened." Calloway raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You don't just accidentally sleep with inmates and smuggle contraband into a prison, Joanna. Start from the beginning." Joanna's story began to unravel as she recounted the months of flirtation and manipulation that led to her affairs with Derek Porter and Malik Johnson. Derek had been the instigator, charming her with compliments and promises of loyalty. Malik had followed soon after, using his quiet intensity to draw her in. Joanna admitted she felt trapped in her marriage and had turned to the inmates for validation, never considering the consequences. "I thought I could control it," Joanna admitted. "I thought it was just harmless fun, but they knew how to get inside my head. They made me feel like I was the only one who understood them." "And what about the HIV?" Calloway asked bluntly. "You infected your husband. Did you know you were carrying the virus?" Joanna's eyes filled with tears. "I swear I didn't know. I only found out when Tom got tested. I was so careful. At least I thought I was. But now I don't even know which one of them gave it to me." Calloway leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Let me get this straight. You risked even cash," the inmate revealed. "And he wasn't just sleeping with her. He was using her to get what he wanted." This information corroborated Joanna's confession, but it also raised another question. How far had the corruption at Fairfield Correctional Facility spread? Calloway suspected Joanna was just the tip of the iceberg. When the medical records finally arrived, they confirmed what Calloway had suspected. Both Derek and Malik were HIV positive. This discovery not only implicated them in Joanna's infection, but also strengthened the case against her. She had knowingly put herself and her husband at risk by engaging in illegal relationships with these men. With the evidence mounting, Calloway prepared to present his findings to the district attorney. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. The prison was a breeding ground for corruption, and he was determined to expose it. Detective Richard Calloway returned to Fairfield Correctional Facility with a renewed sense of purpose. The revelations about Derek and Malik's manipulation of Joanna were disturbing enough, but his gut told him this was just the surface of a larger, more insidious operation. Fairfield wasn't just harboring corrupt guards. It was enabling a system where control and power blurred dangerously between staff and inmates. As he walked the prison corridors, Calloway studied the environment with a sharp eye. The tension in the air was palpable. Guards avoided eye contact, and inmates whispered in hushed tones. It was clear that the facility operated under an unspoken rule. Keep your head down and don't ask questions. Calloway requested another meeting with Warden Howard, the man responsible for overseeing the prison. Howard, a balding, middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, greeted him in his office. "Detective Calloway," Howard said, gesturing to a chair, "I trust you're making progress on your investigation." "Progress, yes," Calloway replied, sitting down. "But what I've found so far is troubling. Officer Marks isn't the only one who's been compromised. This prison has a serious problem with corruption." Howard's expression hardened. "I run a tight ship, Detective. If some of my staff have made poor decisions, that's on them, not me. With all due respect, Warden, this is more than poor decisions. Your officers are being manipulated by inmates, and it's putting everyone at risk. I need full access to staff files and surveillance footage." Howard hesitated but eventually relented. "Fine, but tread carefully, Detective. This place has enough problems without stirring up more trouble." Calloway spent the next several days combing through records and surveillance footage. What he found was damning. Joanna Marks wasn't the only guard who had been compromised. Several others had suspicious patterns of behavior, frequent visits to specific inmates' cells, unexplained absences during shifts, and even signs of smuggling contraband. One name stood out, Officer Brian Mitchell, a veteran guard with a spotless record on paper. But the footage told a different story. Mitchell had been seen entering Derek Porter's cell multiple times, always at odd hours. Calloway flagged Mitchell as a person of interest and requested an interview. When Mitchell sat across from Calloway in the interrogation room, he looked calm, almost defiant. "I don't know what you think I've done, Detective, but I've been here for over a decade. I do my job, and I do it well." "I'm sure you do," Calloway said, leaning back in his chair. "But I have surveillance footage that shows you visiting Derek Porter's cell at least 10 times in the past month. Care to explain?" Mitchell shrugged. "Routine checks. Porter's a high-risk inmate. We keep a close eye on him. Routine checks don't usually involve bringing unlogged items into a cell," Calloway countered. "We both know what's going on here, Mitchell. Derek Porter has something on you, doesn't he?" For the first time, Mitchell's composure faltered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You don't know what you're talking about." Calloway leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "I know Derek Porter's a master manipulator. I know he's been using people like Joanna Marks to get what he wants. And I know you're involved. If you come clean now, I can help you. But if you lied to me, I'll make sure you go down with the rest of them." Mitchell's shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. "Fine. You're right. Porter's got dirt on me. A few years ago, I made a mistake. He found out and threatened to expose me unless I helped him." "What kind of mistake?" Calloway pressed. Mitchell hesitated. "I smuggled in a phone for another inmate. Just once. But Porter found out, and he's been holding it over me ever since." Mitchell's confession opened the floodgates. He revealed that Derek Porter had a network of guards and inmates working for him, all under his control through blackmail or intimidation. The operation was far more extensive than Calloway had imagined. Porter was running a smuggling ring, bringing in everything from drugs to cell phones, and using people like Joanna Marks to do his dirty work. Calloway knew he needed more evidence to dismantle the operation. He requested a covert search of Porter's cell in the surrounding area. What they found confirmed Mitchell's story: hidden compartments filled with contraband, notes detailing transactions, and even a list of guards who were compromised. Meanwhile, Calloway continued to dig into Joanna's relationships with Derek and Malik. He interviewed inmates who had interacted with the two men, piecing together a clearer picture of their manipulation tactics. One inmate described how Derek would prey on vulnerable guards, studying them to find their weaknesses. "He's like a predator," the inmate said. "He knows who to target and how to get under their skin. Once he's got his hooks in you, you're done." Malik, on the other hand, was more subtle. He used his charm and quiet demeanor to gain trust, making people feel like he was their ally. Together, the two men were a dangerous combination, exploiting the system with precision. As Calloway built his case, he also kept a close eye on Joanna. Despite her cooperation, he couldn't ignore the fact that she had willingly participated in the corruption. She had betrayed her husband, her colleagues, and the very institution she was sworn to protect. But as much as he wanted to hold her accountable, he also saw her as a victim of the toxic environment at Fairfield. When the medical records confirmed that Derek had infected Joanna with HIV, Calloway confronted him directly. Sitting across from Derek in the interrogation room, Calloway laid out the evidence. "Joanna Marks," Calloway began, "thought she was helping you because she believed you cared about her. But you didn't, did you? She was just another pawn in your game." Derek smirked, unbothered. "People like her are easy to control. They want to feel special, like they matter. All I did was give her what she wanted. And in return, you ruined her life," Calloway said, his voice hard. "She's lost everything because of you." Derek leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "That's not on me. She made her choices. I just showed her the options." With Derek and Malik's manipulation laid bare, Calloway prepared to present his findings to the district attorney. The case against Joanna, Derek, and the corrupted guards was solid, but Calloway knew the work wasn't over. Detective Richard Calloway sat at his desk late into the evening, poring over stacks of files, interview transcripts, and surveillance footage. His findings were damning, but he still felt a nagging suspicion that something bigger loomed beneath the surface. Derek Porter and Malik Bryant had exploited Fairfield Correctional Facility for years, creating a network of corruption, manipulation, and destruction. But how deep did this go, and how many lives had been ruined along the way? The next morning, Calloway called a meeting with his team to review the evidence. As they filed into the precinct's conference room, the mood was somber. Photographs of Derek, Malik, Joanna, and other compromised guards were pinned to a corkboard, alongside a web of connections outlining the prison's corruption network. "We've got enough to make arrests," Calloway began, "but I want to ensure we're covering all our bases. This isn't just about Derek and Malik. This is about an entire system that allowed their operation to flourish." Officer Karen Ruiz, one of Calloway's most trusted colleagues, nodded in agreement. "Joanna Marks was just one of many. If we don't address the systemic issues, this will keep happening." "Exactly," Calloway said. "I want to dig deeper into the prison's leadership. Warden Howard claims he runs a tight ship, but either he's lying or he's been willfully blind to what's happening under his nose." Calloway decided to bring Warden Howard back in for questioning. This time, the warden's confident facade began to crack under pressure. "Detective, I've told you everything I know," Howard insisted, his voice tinged with frustration. "I had no idea my staff was involved in this kind of behavior." Calloway leaned forward, his eyes locked on Howard's. "You're either incompetent or you're complicit." "Which is it, Warden? Because the evidence suggests you turned a blind eye to some serious red flags." Howard's jaw tightened. "I admit there were signs I should have paid more attention to. But running a prison is no easy task, Detective. Resources are stretched thin, and the staff is overworked. It's easy for things to slip through the cracks." "Things didn't just slip through the cracks," Calloway shot back. "You had guards smuggling contraband, inmates blackmailing staff, and an entire operation running right under your nose. You're responsible for what happens in your facility, Warden." Howard sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "You're right. I should have done more. But I swear, I wasn't involved." Calloway wasn't fully convinced. but he decided to shift his focus. He needed hard evidence to link the warden, or anyone else in leadership, to the corruption. Meanwhile, Calloway received a call from a whistleblower within the prison. The anonymous source claimed to have information about a higher-ranking officer who had been working closely with Derek and Malik. The source agreed to meet at a diner on the outskirts of town. Calloway arrived early, scanning the room for any signs of trouble. The whistleblower turned out to be a young officer named Tony Reed, who looked visibly nervous as he slid into the booth across from Calloway. "I don't have much time," Reed said, glancing around anxiously. "If they find out I'm talking to you, I'm done." "Take your time," Calloway said, his tone calm and reassuring. "You're doing the right thing." Reed hesitated before speaking. "I've seen things, Detective. Things that don't add up. There's a lieutenant, Mark Sullivan. He's been working with Porter and Bryant for years. He pretends to be a by-the-book officer, but he's in deep. He's the one who helps them smuggle in the big stuff. Drugs, weapons, you name it." Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Do you have proof?" Reed nodded. "I've seen him meeting with Porter in the prison storage rooms. They always kick everyone else out. But I overheard a conversation once. Sullivan was telling Porter about a shipment of narcotics coming in." "Why didn't you report this sooner?" Calloway asked. Reed looked down ashamed. "Because I was scared. Sullivan's got connections, and anyone who crosses him ends up getting transferred. Or worse." With this new lead, Calloway shifted his attention to Lieutenant Mark Sullivan. He began digging into Sullivan's financial records, looking for any signs of illicit activity. It didn't take long to find irregularities, large deposits in Sullivan's bank account that couldn't be explained by his salary. Further investigation revealed ties to known drug traffickers, as well as property purchases far beyond what Sullivan's income could support. Calloway also had surveillance teams monitor Sullivan's movements. They observed him meeting with individuals outside the prison, including a man with ties to a local cartel. It was clear that Sullivan was deeply involved in the corruption network. As Calloway pieced together the evidence, he couldn't shake the emotional toll of the case. Joanna Marks had been manipulated and betrayed, but she had also made choices that devastated her family. Her husband, Robert, was struggling to cope with the betrayal and his diagnosis. Calloway reached out to Robert, hoping to provide some closure. When they met at a local park, Robert looked tired and defeated. "What do you want, Detective?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I just wanted to check in," Calloway said gently. "I know this has been a nightmare for you." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know the half of it. My wife, she destroyed everything we built together, and now I'm left to pick up the pieces." "I'm sorry for what you've been through," Calloway said, "but I want you to know that we're getting closer to the truth." Joanna wasn't acting alone. She was part of something much bigger. Robert's expression darkened. "I don't care about the bigger picture, Detective. All I care about is my kids. They're the only reason I'm still standing." Calloway nodded, understanding the weight of Robert's words. "We'll make sure the people responsible are held accountable. You have my word." As Calloway prepared to bring charges against Sullivan, Derek, Malik, and the other key players, he knew the case was far from over. The corruption at Fairfield Correctional Facility was a symptom of a broken system, one that allowed power and greed to thrive at the expense of justice. But for now, Calloway had taken a significant step toward unraveling the web of deceit, and he wouldn't stop until every thread was exposed. Detective Richard Calloway wasn't the type to leave any stone unturned. The evidence against Lieutenant Mark Sullivan was piling up, but Calloway knew that simply arresting him wasn't enough. To dismantle the entire operation, he needed a confession, or a witness brave enough to testify. Meanwhile, Joanna Marks remained in custody. Though cooperative in earlier interrogations, she had become withdrawn and guarded. Calloway suspected she knew more than she had let on, particularly about Sullivan's involvement and the broader network operating within Fairfield Correctional Facility. The next morning, Calloway met with Joanna in a private interrogation room. She looked pale and tired, her once confident demeanor replaced with a quiet resignation. "Joanna," Calloway began, sliding a cup of coffee across the table to her, "we need to talk about Lieutenant Sullivan." Joanna's eyes flickered with recognition, but she said nothing. "We know he's been working with Derek and Malik," Calloway continued. We have witnesses, bank records, and surveillance footage. But we need more. Something that ties him directly to the operation. Joanna hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. I've already told you everything I know, she muttered. I don't think you have, Calloway said firmly. You're protecting someone, and it's not worth it. Sullivan's not going to take the fall for you. In fact, he'll throw you under the bus the first chance he gets. Joanna's face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. You don't understand. If I talk, they'll come after me, or my family. We can protect you, Calloway assured her, but you have to help us. This is your chance to make things right. After a long silence, Joanna finally spoke. Sullivan was the one who introduced Derek and Malik to the operation. He's been running the show for years. I didn't know the full extent of it until I was already in too deep. By then, there was no way out. Did Sullivan threaten you? Calloway asked. Joanna nodded. He told me that if I ever said anything, he'd make sure my career and my life were over. He had connections everywhere, even outside the prison. I was scared. With Joanna's testimony, Calloway had enough to secure an arrest warrant for Sullivan, but he knew the lieutenant wouldn't go down without a fight. To strengthen the case, Calloway decided to confront Derek and Malik again, hoping they might corroborate Joanna's story. The two men were brought into separate interrogation rooms. Calloway started with Derek, whose cocky attitude had already worn thin after weeks of isolation. You think Sullivan's going to save you? Calloway asked, leaning across the table. He's cutting deals to protect himself as we speak. If you don't cooperate, you're going to take the fall for everything. Derek scoffed. You're bluffing, Calloway smirked. Am I? We've got Joanna's testimony, your bank records, and Sullivan's financial transactions. You're not as untouchable as you think. Derek's confidence faltered, but he remained silent. Next, Calloway turned his attention to Malik, who seemed more shaken by the investigation. Malik had always been the more cautious of the two, and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence was clearly weighing on him. You're looking at decades behind bars, Malik, Calloway said. But if you cooperate, we can work something out. Help us take down Sullivan, and you might have a shot at reducing your sentence. Malik stared at the table, his hands trembling. Sullivan's the one who got us started, he admitted quietly. He told us how to smuggle stuff in, who to bribe, and how to cover our tracks. We wouldn't have been able to do any of this without him. Armed with Malik's confession and Joanna's testimony, Calloway moved quickly to arrest Sullivan. The lieutenant was taken into custody during his shift, his face a mask of anger and disbelief as officers escorted him out of the prison in handcuffs. During questioning, Sullivan remained defiant, denying any involvement in the corruption network. But the evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, surveillance footage, and witness statements painted a damning picture of his role in the operation. You're done, Sullivan, Calloway said during the interrogation. You can keep denying it, but the evidence speaks for itself. Sullivan glared at Calloway, his jaw clenched. You think you've won, don't you? This isn't over. Calloway's expression remained calm. Oh, it's over, and you're going to prison for a very long time. With Sullivan's arrest, the corruption network at Fairfield Correctional Facility began to unravel. Several other officers were implicated in the investigation, and additional arrests followed. The prison's leadership faced intense scrutiny, leading to widespread reforms and a renewed focus on accountability. Joanna Marks, Derek Porter, and Malik Bryant were also charged for their roles in the operation. While Joanna expressed remorse for her actions, her involvement had caused irreparable damage to her family and career. For Detective Calloway, the case was a bittersweet victory. He had succeeded in exposing a deeply entrenched web of corruption, but the cost had been high. Lives had been destroyed, trust shattered, and the scars left behind would take years to heal. As he packed up his files and prepared to move on to the next case, Calloway couldn't help but reflect on the lessons he had learned. Justice was never simple, and the truth often came at a price. But in the end, it was worth it, because every victory, no matter how small, made a difference. The fallout from the investigation into Fairfield Correctional Facility sent shockwaves throughout the small town. The once pristine reputation of the prison was now tarnished beyond repair, and the public demanded answers. For Detective Richard Calloway, the case wasn't just about bringing the corrupt to justice. It was about exposing the broader system that had allowed such corruption to fester. But for Joanna Marks, the repercussions of her choices were far more personal. Her life had unraveled in ways she never could have imagined. Joanna sat in her cell at the county jail, staring blankly at the cinder block wall. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional clanging of doors and murmured conversations from other inmates. She couldn't stop thinking about her husband, Greg. Greg had been her anchor, her safe harbor in a chaotic world. And now she had destroyed everything they had built together. The guilt weighed heavily on her, a constant ache that no amount of tears could erase. When Greg had learned of her infidelity and the HIV diagnosis, his reaction had been one of devastation and fury. He couldn't comprehend how the woman he had loved and trusted could betray him so completely. Joanna had tried to explain, to apologize, but there was no justification for what she had done. Greg had filed for divorce shortly after Joanna's arrest. He had also undergone testing to confirm his HIV status, and although he was still reeling from the diagnosis, he was determined to move forward with his life. Detective Calloway watched the events unfold with a mix of satisfaction and unease. He had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? Joanna wasn't the only one whose life had been shattered by the investigation. Derek Porter and Malik Bryant, the two inmates who had been at the center of the operation, were transferred to a high-security prison pending their trial. Their cooperation with the investigation had earned them some leniency, but they were still facing decades behind bars. Lieutenant Mark Sullivan, however, remained defiant. During his arraignment, he had pleaded not guilty to all charges, despite the mountain of evidence against him. Calloway knew that Sullivan's trial would be a spectacle, with the former lieutenant attempting to paint himself as a victim of a corrupt system. The trial date was set for 6 months later, giving Calloway and the prosecution team time to prepare. Meanwhile, Calloway's focus shifted to the broader implications of the case. The corruption at Fairfield Correctional Facility wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger problem within the prison system, where underfunding, inadequate oversight, and a culture of complacency had created fertile ground for misconduct. Calloway began working with state officials to implement reforms, including stricter monitoring of prison staff, improved training programs, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee. This isn't just about punishing the guilty, Calloway told a local reporter during a press conference. It's about ensuring that something like this never happens again. Back at the county jail, Joanna received a letter from Greg. It was short and to the point, but it gave her a glimmer of hope. Joanna, I'm still trying to process everything that's happened. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, but I need to focus on myself and my health. I hope you find peace with your choices and learn from them. Greg. Joanna clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She knew she couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but she was determined to take responsibility for her actions and make amends in any way she could. Calloway's investigation into Sullivan continued to uncover new layers of deceit. Financial records revealed that Sullivan had been funneling money into offshore accounts, suggesting that he had been preparing for the possibility of being caught. But what shocked Calloway the most was a series of encrypted emails between Sullivan and a high-ranking prison official. The emails hinted at an even larger network of corruption, one that extended far beyond Fairfield Correctional Facility. This isn't over, Calloway muttered to himself as he reviewed the evidence. Not by a long shot. As the months passed, the community began to heal. The reforms implemented at Fairfield Correctional Facility brought about positive changes, and the public's trust in the justice system slowly began to rebuild. For Calloway, the case served as a reminder of the importance of perseverance and integrity. He had faced countless obstacles and setbacks, but he had never given up. As he prepared for Sullivan's trial, Calloway couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had uncovered the truth, exposed corruption, and held the guilty accountable. But he also knew that his work was far from over. The trial of Lieutenant Mark Sullivan was a media spectacle. Courtrooms were packed, reporters lined the streets, and the scandal dominated the headlines. For Detective Richard Calloway, it was the culmination of months of painstaking work. Every detail of the case had been dissected, leaving no room for doubt about Sullivan's guilt. The prosecution presented an airtight case. Financial records, surveillance footage, testimonies from Derek Porter, Malik Bryant, and Joanna Marks, all painted Sullivan as the mastermind behind a criminal network that had exploited Fairfield Correctional Facility for personal gain. The defense, however, was determined to muddy the waters. Sullivan's lawyer argued that the lieutenant had been set up by disgruntled inmates and a bitter colleague. They painted him as a victim of the system, a man who had tried to maintain order in a chaotic environment, but had been betrayed by those closest to him. But the evidence was overwhelming. Calloway had ensured that every piece of the puzzle fit perfectly. Joanna Marks' testimony proved particularly damning. Though visibly nervous on the stand, Joanna recounted the full extent of Sullivan's manipulation and threats. He made it clear that if I didn't cooperate, I'd lose my job. Or worse, she said, her voice trembling. I was scared. He had connections everywhere. The courtroom was silent as Joanna described how Sullivan had orchestrated the smuggling operation, using Derek and Malik as his primary enforcers. She admitted her own culpability, expressing deep remorse for her actions. I made terrible choices, she said, tears streaming down her face. But I didn't act alone. Sullivan was the one pulling the strings. The prosecution also introduced damning evidence from Sullivan's encrypted emails. These communications revealed his dealings with other corrupt officials, implicating him in a larger network of criminal activity. One email, in particular, stood out: a detailed plan to flee the country if the operation was ever exposed. This isn't just about one man's greed, the prosecutor argued during closing statements. It's about a culture of corruption that thrives when people like Mark Sullivan abuse their power. Today, we have the opportunity to send a message. No one is above the law. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On a cold, rainy afternoon, the foreperson stood and delivered the words that everyone in the courtroom had been waiting to hear. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mark Sullivan, guilty on all counts. A ripple of relief and satisfaction swept through the courtroom. Sullivan sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. The sentence was swift and severe: 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. For Detective Calloway, the verdict was a hard-fought victory, but he knew that Sullivan was just one piece of a larger puzzle. The encrypted emails hinted at a widespread network of corruption, and Calloway was determined to follow the trail wherever it led. This isn't the end, he told his captain after the trial. There are still others out there, and I'm going to find them. Joanna Marks was also sentenced, though her cooperation earned her a reduced sentence of 5 years. In her final conversation with Calloway before being transferred to a federal prison, she expressed gratitude for the opportunity to come clean. I know I've done terrible things, she said, her voice heavy with regret. But I want to believe it's not too late to make amends. Calloway nodded. The fact that you're willing to take responsibility is a step in the right direction. Use this time to rebuild. As the dust settled, Calloway returned to his office to reflect on the case. The Fairfield scandal had been one of the most challenging investigations of his career, but it had also been one of the most rewarding. He had exposed a web of corruption, held the guilty accountable, and initiated reforms that would prevent similar abuses in the future. But Calloway knew that the fight for justice was never over. Corruption, greed, and betrayal were ever-present threats, and it was up to people like him to stand against them. As he looked out the window at the city below, Calloway felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Because justice was worth the fight.